Hello and welcome to this special edition of Countercurrents. I'm Larry Johnson. Um, Today I want to go over the three-part series I did on my blog. It was dealt with the road to war in Ukraine, looking at the history of NATO and U.S. military exercises with Ukraine. I spent over 23 years scripting military exercises for U.S. military special operations forces. Although I was never directly involved in any of the specific exercises that were done with Ukraine, these were more in the terms of what I'd call conventional military as opposed to special operations. The process is the same, and the goal is the same. Military exercises are scenarios that are created to elicit reaction on the part of various military forces, to test communications between those various forces, to test logistics, to test interoperations, how different units operate with each other. All of this is done with an eye towards the possibility of going either to war, being engaged in attacking an adversary. So these are not inconsequential events. These are very, very serious. And it's important to understand that the military exercises that were conducted via NATO and the United States European Command, based in Stuttgart, Germany, these were not haphazard. These were planned events. And the planning that goes into this suggests that this was part of a broader strategy. So I want to take you back to 1992. The Soviet Union had collapsed, and now you had Russia and Ukraine as separate entities. Russia was not vowing to expand its military. The entire purpose for NATO originally was to prevent and defeat a Soviet invasion of Europe, one which was, again, that was always a pretense. The Soviets had no such intention. But now, a year after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole process of turning Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO started. And I want to emphasize that even though Ukraine is not a formal member of NATO, it is, in fact, a de facto member of NATO. There's only two areas in which it doesn't reflect a full NATO membership. One, there's no Article 5 guarantee that other NATO members will come to fight on behalf of Ukraine if attacked. And Ukraine is under no obligation to contribute financially to NATO. But apart from that, Ukraine has been a member of NATO in every other aspect. And in fact, as I'll discuss later, during the decade that started in 2000, Ukraine hosted more NATO and U.S. European Command exercises than 22 NATO countries. NATO, by 2004, had a total of 28 countries. And so just think about that. Ukraine was hosting more NATO exercises than 22 of the other NATO members. That's what I mean when Ukraine was, in fact, a de facto member of NATO. So this process of making Ukraine a de facto member started in 92, 1 year after the collapse of the Soviet Union. 1994 marked the first year that Ukrainian forces participated in NATO exercises, and even though those were held in Poland and the Netherlands. But we saw this process that started in 92 accelerate until the end of the decade. And in 1999, when four other European countries in violation of the promise that James Baker had made to Boris Yeltsin. Four new members of NATO were introduced, moving NATO closer to Russia's western borders. So in 1992, Ukraine formally established relations with NATO by joining the North Atlantic Cooperation Council in March of 1992. This North Atlantic Cooperation Council had been established by NATO in 1991 to serve as a forum for dialogue and cooperation between NATO member states, as well as the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, which included the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pacts. Now, Russia also was a member. I don't want to suggest that it wasn't. Now, this NAC, NACC, let's call it that, was created to foster both political consultation, this is ostensible reason, political consultation, build confidence among former adversaries, reflecting what NATO called its hand of friendship to these newly independent and transitioning states. Calling them transitioning states. It makes you think it's like a transgender movement. But what the NAC really was up to was looking to establish a deeper level of cooperation. And this was followed by the launching of the Partnership for Peace program in 1994, which created a mechanism, a structure, a financial vehicle for individual cooperation between NATO and partner countries. And Ukraine quickly moved to the top of the list as a partner country. This North Atlantic Cooperation Council, the NACC, only lasted until 1997 when it was replaced by what was called the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. So this was designed to expand the framework so they could include more countries, and provided what was considered a more sophisticated forum for these various countries to come together, have an annual meeting, conference, guest speakers, and hobnobbing and interacting with each other over cocktails. Russia joined the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council as well, but it was suspended in 2014 after the people of Crimea voted to reunite with Russia. Russia was accused of storming and taking over the country. The first exercise that Ukraine participated in was called Cooperation Bridge. It was a joint training exercise that took place in September of 1994. Let's go to 1993, though, for a second, because in 1993, the U.S. European Command was advocating setting up what are called military liaison teams in Kiev, but they didn't really get put in place until 1994. And 1994 was when the whole military exercise with Ukraine began. Russia was allowed to observe, but NATO was not as keen on conducting military exercises. The Cooperative Bridge 94 involved 600 soldiers from 13 NATO and partner nations. So that was the first adventure for Ukraine. It also, later in that same year, participated in another Partnership for Peace exercise, military exercise, that was held in the Netherlands. 1995 then became really the first year where foreign forces started moving into Ukraine to conduct exercises. The Operation Peace Shield was held in late May, at the Yavoriv training area, which is near Lviv in western Poland. Yavoriv becomes more important because in 2007, it basically becomes a de facto NATO base. And it is then hit by Russian missiles on March 13th, 2022. So this was, Russia was sending a very clear message to NATO with that attack. But you had basically two major exercises in 1995, Peace Shield and Autumn Allies. And again, these were always couched as exercises to promote defense, not offense. But anybody who's ever been involved with doing military exercises know it's like writing a Hollywood movie script. You got to have a villain. Who's the villain? Throughout the majority of these exercises over 30 years, there was only one villain. It was Russia, because these exercises were targeted at going after Russia. And it was, as we said, started in 95 and accelerated to 96, 97, where the joint exercises that were taking place at Yavoriv were then supplemented in 97 with the first iteration of Operation Sea Breeze. Sea Breeze was always touted as a multinational maritime exercise that was co-hosted by the United States and Ukraine. And it included U.S. Marines and Ukrainian forces. The first scenario that was initially announced was to simulate intervention in a fictional ethnic conflict. Not that we got any ethnic conflicts in Ukraine, heaven no. But the Russians protested it back then, so the scenario was revised to provide humanitarian aid after an earthquake. But this exercise was taking place. Initially, it was supposed to take place in Crimea, but local protests and Russian opposition forced them to move it to mainland Ukraine. But the point is, all of this was being done with, in the background, in the U.S. plans, on paper, Russia was the enemy. And this 1997 exercise was important as well because that was the year that NATO and Ukraine established a distinctive partnership. It was the Charter on Distinctive Partnership. It was signed in July of 97, and it set up a framework for, as the document described, ongoing military and political collaborations. So this was really 97 was the time that the full-on effort to integrate Ukraine into the Euro-Atlantic Alliance. And all of this ultimately was a plan to take out Russia. There were 4 exercises in 1998. So we went from 2 in 95. Now they're up to 4. Cossack Express in May of 98. Peace Shield in June. Sea Breeze in July. And Cooperative Nugget in September. Cooperative Nugget focused on peacekeeping operations, joint command structures, multinational cooperation. So the multinational coordination, this is all euphemisms for Ukraine fighting alongside NATO forces. Notice that with each set of exercises, like the ones that took place in 95, the planning for those actually started the preceding year in late 93 or at the very earliest January of 94. So when I'm talking about an exercise that takes place in 1999, understand that the planning for that started at least 18 months prior to that date. 1999 was a pivotal year because that was the year that Romania, Poland, Slovakia, and I think the Czech Republic joined NATO. and pushed, in spite of the promise that had been made by James Baker, not 1 inch, he told Boris Yeltsin, not 1 inch eastward. Nonetheless, the United States moved 1 inch eastward. And you had Peace Shield in 99, Cooperative Partner, Seabreeze, Cossack Express, Cossack Steppe, Black Sea Partnership, 6 military exercises. And some of these were spent in the Black Sea. So that takes us through 1999. The start of 2000, though, is when this process expanded. And Ukraine's status as a de facto member of NATO became secure. Not only did it participate in all of the main NATO exercises, but it was one of the major hosts for NATO exercises. There was only one other NATO country that did almost as much as Ukraine, and that was Georgia. There's no coincidence that Georgia and Ukraine were being groomed by NATO. NATO was like a pedophile, grooming Ukraine and Georgia for their ultimate admission into the NATO club. And all of this was done with an eye towards surrounding Russia to ultimately be able to attack and destroy Russia. And I don't think the Russian people should harbor any illusions about what was intended here. In 2007, that was the important exercise year because Yavoriv was officially established as a NATO base. It wasn't, you wouldn't find it listed necessarily on NATO documents as a base, but it became designated as the primary training facility for NATO. In 2007, NATO and Ukraine, they conducted a command post exercise in Sevastopol. And they maintained a program of military cooperation under the NATO-Ukraine military work plan and annual target plan. So every year they would sit down and plan out what was coming down the next year or the year after that. The NATO annual target plan for 2007 outlines the steps for cooperation, both in political, military, and security spheres. And all of this was with an eye towards including exercises and advisory activities to improve Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration. Now, the size of the Ukrainian army at this time, it was roughly in the area of 200,000. It may have shrunk down to 196,000 and was slowly building back up. But what Ukraine did not have was a large number of reserves, National Guard, border police, etc. So these NATO exercises, what they were doing was they were helping to train and equip military reserves, not only active duty personnel, but they're starting to build the reserve program. Now, it was only in its very beginning in the 2000s. And this was during the presidency of George W. Bush, followed by Barack Obama. It was noteworthy, though, that 2007 was a big year where Vladimir Putin warned against NATO expansion, and that specifically Ukraine and Georgia should not be brought into NATO. That was a red line for Russia. It was but that went over the heads of the NATO members and the United States. And it was in August of 2008 that attacks took place on Russian civilians and border personnel that led to the war in Georgia, which Russia quickly won. But that again was part of a broader, long-term NATO effort to use Ukraine, to build up Ukraine as a military force that could confront and defeat Russia. This cooperation and exercise program continued under Barack Obama. As I noted, that the Yavoriv facility became quite important. From it had been used the previous 11 years, but it now became really an institutional place for NATO. So as we enter the decade that's starting in 2011, Barack Obama is president, and the plans are afoot for moving Ukraine decisively into the Western camp. And all of this culminated with the Maidan coup in February 2014. By 2010, the Ukrainian army had 245,000 personnel. But when you get down, the reserves are still pretty low. It wasn't until by the end of, let's say, 2013, the actual military strength of Ukraine had declined to 165,000, and then they had another 120,000 reserve personnel. So the Ukrainian army really was quite small prior to the Maidan. And by way of comparison, the Russian army was not building up either. It was not on a massive expansion. It was actually, it shrunk somewhat going into the decade of 2010. So this, despite, by 2010, despite, having 15 years and conducting joint military exercises with the United States, the effort to boost the capability of Ukraine, it really started accelerating under Barack Obama. Now, the international, the NATO facility at Yavoriv, it was known as the International Peacekeeping and Security Center. And again, this became a real focal point for NATO operations, including such things as cyber warfare. On one of the U.S. Yukon military sites, they used to have a page, I think they took it down last I checked, that highlighted, they were working an exercise that was described as carrying out cyber warfare attacks. So an offensive operation, not a defensive operation. So Yavoriv became the center for an exercise that started under Barack Obama. It was called Rapid Trident. Trident being the symbol of that Ukraine seized upon as its national symbol. It is important to note that these exercises were always presented as being defensive in nature in the event that Russia did something heinous. But when you get into the actual substance of these exercises, so, for example, Rapid Trident in 2011, it was described as multinational interoperability, peacekeeping operations, joint command structures. Nothing alarming there. How about Seabreeze 2011, maritime security, anti-piracy, and air defense operations. But let's jump ahead to 2017. President at that time, fellow named Donald John Trump. And Donald John Trump, despite his claims that he had nothing to do with this terrible war in Ukraine, it's actually under Trump that the Ukrainian military undergoes a dramatic expansion. It grows from roughly a total force with active duty and reserves of around 320,000 to active duty and reserves of 1.2 million by December of 2020. It's a 3.6. They grew by a factor of 3.6. That happened under Donald Trump. Operation Seabreeze, that exercise in 2017, focus is military security operations, amphibious warfare, and anti-submarine warfare. So all of a sudden, gone from piracy to amphibious warfare and anti-submarine warfare. There are videos on the internet from 2017 showing U.S. Marines in landing craft landing on the shores of Ukraine in the Black Sea. So the United States was clearly gearing up and preparing Ukraine for war with Russia, because this was an amphibious warfare directed against Martians or against mermaids. This amphibious warfare was going to be directed against only one country. That was Russia. And it should have been clear at that point what the intent of the United States was. It was also during Donald Trump's tenure that is all these exercises. In 2019, there was Seabreeze, Saber Guardian, Rapid Trident, Maple Arch, Joint Endeavor, as well as the U.S. Army did a number. There are 9 exercises in the Black Sea and Balkan regions that the Ukrainians also participated in. But in 2020, Trump did something that was beyond provocative, or it happened under Donald Trump. Whether he was briefed on it, I don't know. But on September 4th, U.S. B-52 Stratofortress bombers entered Ukrainian airspace for the first time, and they conducted a long flight along the borders of Crimea. This was a direct and deliberate provocation to Russia. Could you imagine Russian strategic bombers flying along the Mexican-U.S. border and the United States saying nothing? Absolutely not. It wouldn't happen. So Donald Trump's claim that he was just some sort of innocent guy trying to promote peace, it's nonsense. It's a lie. He was actively involved. Or at least his administration was actively involved. In fact, A. Wes Mitchell, who published an important piece in the National Interest in August of 2021, had actually been commissioned while Donald Trump was still president to write an article, a research piece, and a policy paper, I guess, for the Office of Net Assessments at the Pentagon. And they were asking the question, what do we do to prevent Russia and China from coming together? And how do we keep Russia from becoming a threat? And his prescription, if you go through the paper, was real simple. Use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia. Defeat Russia in a war. Weaken it to the point that it will want to align itself with the West. And that way we can use Russia then as a battering ram against China. That was the strategic thinking that started that was at least being openly expressed in 2019, 2020, and then put out into the public in August of 2021. So this road to war in Ukraine, this was part of a long-term NATO plan of provocation. Russia, throughout this period, particularly during the 1990s, at no point in the 1990s and early 2000s was Russia doing anything militarily to suggest that it was planning to build up its forces to invade and attack other countries, just the opposite. Yet instead of the West embracing Russia and bringing Russia in as a friend, as a partner, as a, their much touted Partnership for Peace program, Russia was treated as an enemy, as a threat. And the eye all along was on the rich natural resources that Russia possesses, that the West is lusting to get control of. So that's where we are. NATO remains in a very, very aggressive posture towards Russia, and it may be necessary for Russia to defend itself against a NATO attack in the near future. NATO members already are talking about trying to shut down and impose an embargo in the Black Sea to prevent Russian ships from leaving, as well as trying to take over the Russian territory in Kaliningrad. Any moves like this would precipitate a war of horrific proportions. Europe, of course, would lose, and lose badly. I don't hope for that, but that may be the only thing that will save Russia ultimately from the predatory desires of the West. That's the overview of the road to war in Ukraine, looking at it from the standpoint of the history of military exercises. If you want to read what I put together in more detail, you can go to sonar21.com. But meanwhile, thank you for watching Countercurrents. I'm Larry Johnson. Please hit the like and subscribe button. And if you thought this useful, share with your friends. Thank you so much. Goodbye.